Hello and welcome back for another VMK in the game development series. In this VMK we're going to create the class that we're going to use for radio buttons. This class is going to heavily depend on the previous VMK where we created the class that contains the GUI button. Radio buttons are very similar to regular buttons, but they're grouped together so that you can only have one selected and all the other ones will be unselected. You've seen radio buttons many times inside regular Windows applications, so I wanted to add in this functionality into our game engine because there will be certain points where you want to allow the user to select between different things and have a control that encapsulates the radio effect. So let's get started. We're going to begin by going into the object lib and adding a new item. We're going to call it GUI radio and do this again for the CPP. And let's start off with the .h. At the top we need to include GUI control and GUI button. We need GUI control because all GUI items are going to inherit from GUI control, and we also need GUI button because a radio button is going to be a collection of regular GUI buttons. Our constructor takes in an ID number. It has a pointer to our first button in the radio, and we can specify whether we want our radio buttons to be vertically aligned or horizontally aligned. The spacing between each button is going to be specified by this value right here. We have a destructor, and then we have some accessor functions to get the root position, set the root position. The root position is the coordinate for the very first button that we're going to be placing. From there we're going to be offsetting by this spacing amount to position all the other buttons in the radio group. We can add a button, so we begin with one button, but then we continue adding buttons to have a collection of buttons. And each button that we add is going to be associated with this radio so that as you toggle between one and another, all the other ones will appropriately flip to whatever value they should be. We have an option here to set a button, which means activate a specific button inside of this list. And we have a function called getButton, which just retrieves a button ID. We also need to have the check hotspot, stop pressed, and render functions because these are the ones that GUI control asks us to create whenever we inherit from it. Our member variables consist of the flag that tells us whether we're vertical or horizontal, the spacing value, and a std vector which contains all the buttons that are part of this radio group. Alright, let's go into the CPP file to take a look at the implementation. At the top, we have including stdafx.h and GUI radio.h. Our constructor is comprised as following. We have our regular parameters passing in here, and then we also need to construct our GUI control, but this time we specify to use GUI_radio as our parameter, since we are going to be creating a radio button. The ID number we saved inside of our member variables. The position for the radio is going to be the location of the very first button that gets passed in here. So we get the X and the Y position, create a vertex 2 object out of those, and assign that to our position for this radio control. The vertical and spacing values are saved directly into our member variables, and we initially set the first button, which is this button right here, to be true. So we always have at least one button to be selected to be true inside of a radio group. We then take our std vector, which will contain all of our buttons, and push onto it our very first button that gets passed into here. So anytime you create a radio button, you have to make sure you first create this GUI button, and then once you have that, you can then go and create this GUI radio. Our destructor is responsible for cleaning up all of the radio buttons that are saved inside of our vector over here. So we need to go through that vector from 0 up to the full size, deleting all of the buttons, and then we can call clear to remove any references to those buttons. If we don't do this, we'll have a memory leak because we're passing in pointers to GUI buttons into the constructor, and if we don't clean them up, we're basically going to have a memory leak. Alright, getting the root position. This returns the X and Y coordinates of the very first button in the list or in the radio group. So the way we handle this is we create a vertex 2 here, which will contain the position, and we check to make sure that the size of our button is greater than 0, which means that there has been something saved, which there should be, because in the constructor we're always pushing back the very first button. We extract the X and the Y position of the button and save that into our vertex 2 value here, which we then go and return directly out of this function. So going into PaintShop Pro here, when we first initialize our radio button, we're passing in a GUI button into that radio group, which is going to have a position, let's say right here, for this button. So we're going to render that on the screen. But then we can also go in and add other buttons. We can say, okay, we're going to be adding these vertically. So every time we go in and add a new button, it's going to be offset by a certain value that we can specify, and we can set this value to be positive or negative, and it will just automatically move each of these buttons into the correct location. If we do vertical, that's what it's going to look like. If we do horizontal, then the buttons would look something like this. And again, the spacing would be from here over to the next one and so on. And all these buttons would obviously line up in a nice straight line. Okay, so getting the root will return the position of the very first item inside of the group. We can set the root position, which means that after we've created all the buttons, we can go in and move them around to position them wherever we want on the screen. We're not restricted to the position of the location of this first button. When we first create it, that's where they're going to be located, but if you don't like them there, you can still update them using this set root position function, which will basically take a look to make sure that we have some buttons to move, and if we do, it's going to get the X and the Y coordinate of the very first button, and going through all the buttons in the list, we're going to extract the X and Y positions, and depending on if it's vertical or horizontal, we then call the set position X and set position Y appropriate for the value for the X and the Y values. So if we're going vertical, we're going to be offsetting by the spacing value. If we're going horizontal, we're going to be offsetting by the spacing value for the X. To set a button, we're basically going through and making sure we enable one button and disabling all others. The I button value that gets passed into here is 1 based, but all of our buttons are saved in a vector which is 0 based. So to compensate for this, we're going to subtract 1 from I button. This is what this is doing here. And then we check to make sure that I button now is not greater than or equal to the maximum size, or it's less than 0. If either of these cases are true, then the I button value is invalid, so we cannot set the button to this value. If this passes, then we know we have the correct I button value, which means, for instance, if you set up to make the third button active, then that means we have at least 3 buttons inside of our group. So what we're going to do is go through all the buttons in our list. If this I value is equal to the I button value, we're going to set it to be true. Otherwise, we're going to be setting it to false so that all the appropriate states of these buttons in the radio set are set to the right value. We can get the radio state of a button just by going through a for loop through all the buttons and checking to see which one is pressed. As soon as we find the one that is pressed, we're going to return that ID number plus 1, because again, we're going to be returning a 1-based number, not a 0-based number. If we don't find a button that is pressed, then we're just going to default to return 0, which means that the first button, or the button that is initialized, is going to be set. When we're creating a radio list, we need to add multiple buttons to our group. We start off with 1 button, but then we need to go in and manually add all the other ones that we want to have associated with the radio set. So we're going to call add button, and we're going to pass in a pointer to the next GUI button we want to add. What we do is we get the X and Y position of the button that we're going to be adding to. So in other words, we're taking the previous button that's already saved inside of our vector. We're getting its X and Y value, and then if we're stacking the radio buttons vertically, we're going to offset the Y, and if we're stacking them horizontally, we're going to offset the X. And the offset is specified by the spacing value. The last thing we do is we need to save the button that we get passed into this function into our array, so we call pushback and we pass in the P button value. We need to have a check hotspot function so that we can set the button's over and press state based on the location of the mouse and the button state. This is going to work similar to the GUI button check hotspot. However, we need to take care of the case of toggling the ones that we don't select to the off state. First thing we do is we set up some variables here that we're going to be using. We check to see if we can find a button that is pressed or is actually over top of. So whenever we find which of the buttons in our group this is, we're going to set this flag to be true, and our return ID value is going to be the ID number of the button that the mouse is over top of. We then go into this if statement. If the current value is equal to the I button value, which is the button we're over top of, then we check to see if we're pressing the mouse button or not. If we are, then we're going to set the state here to be pressed. Otherwise, we're just going to set the state to be over. If we're working with the button that's not the one that we're over top of or pressing, then we're going to set the press state to be false and the over state to be false as well. So this makes sure that only one button is ever pressed or over top of, and all the other ones are not pressed and not over top of. If we don't find a button here that we are over top of or being pressed, then we just make sure that all the set over values for all the buttons is set to false so that none of them are activated. And finally, we just return the ID number of the one that was selected so that you can handle that appropriately later on. We don't do anything with the stop pressing function, so it's blank. And the last thing we have here is rendering. Rendering is relatively simple because all we need to do is call the render function for each of the buttons that we have inside of our vector. So that's exactly what we do here. We go through a for loop for every single button we have inside of our vector, and we call its own render function. So that's it. If we go and compile this, I think everything should be fine. Come back for the next video where I'll show you how to use this radio class so that you can implement your own radio buttons.